This video is indeed rated B for you'd better back on out of here if you don't want spoilers, buddy. The release of patch 7.4 marks the beginning of new setup and tales within the story of Final Fantasy XIV. So, let's start from the beginning and steadily work our way through the MSQ and use our understanding of the lore to break everything down. Our story starts with the Warrior of Light, Scions, and all their new friends coming to grips with the fact that their work here is more or less done. They aided with Tural's right of succession as requested, and solved the mysteries of Solution 9, and even helped Alexandria establish its new future. Now it was up to these lands and its people to decide how they want to proceed from here. But if Alexandria was indeed here to stay, then the Scions felt it necessary to spread word of its emergence, as the sudden arrival of a technological superpower might be seen as a threat by some nations, especially when word of Tuliolal's initial invasion would eventually become global news. And, seen as the world had only just recently lost a technological conqueror in the form of Garlemald, Alexandria would certainly be on a watch list by at least a handful of nations. In fact, it's only thanks to our valiant heroes that Alexandria is even seen on good terms in the first place with Tuliolal at this point, as some of its people would likely still hold resentment toward losing loved ones in their premier attack. But even though the two nations now have peace between them, there are still many tribes and cultures surrounding Alexandria's dome that might not be ecstatic to have such a new and advanced neighbor. For example, if some train tracks were enough to upset the day-to-day of just one Turali tribe, imagine the chaos the 11 Domes emergence had on all the surrounding ecosystems. Suffice to say, while the foundations of peace have been set, the work has only just begun for Tural. As for the characters themselves, Erenville thought that he could sneak away with a quick thank you, which nobody was having. Instead, they all made sure to give him a proper send-off, as Erenville expressed that he wants to continue exploring the world like his mother before him. While it was indeed a shock to learn of his mother's untimely death, getting the chance to speak with her memories, even for a short time, provided him with some closure. Content in knowing that her spirit may yet still be watching over him, Erenville set off toward new horizons. Accompanying him are the twins, Alphino and Alize, as they feel their time in Tural, while informative, has kept them away from other promises for long enough. The twins have chosen to return to Garlemald and continue to aid in its reconstruction. Which is well enough, because while Tuliolal and Alexandria may share a mutual understanding now, the same cannot be said for Garlemald and its neighboring nations. We have to remember that Garlemald successfully annexed most all of Ilsabard and Othard. They had even sunk their fangs into the continent of Aldenard, and were one good conquest away from having conquered all three of the great continents, much like the Allegan Empire before them. In the current timeline, Garlemald's invading forces and political structure have only just recently collapsed, meaning the very real potential for retaliation is still on the horizon. Alphino and Alize have their work cut out for them, as it will likely take much more than some heartfelt words to make the subjugated nations lay down their desire for revenge. One need not look much further than what happened to Bozia to understand why some nations would not want Garlemald to get away without some form of punishment or reparations. It ultimately doesn't matter if the remaining Garleans had little or nothing to do with the war, as many nations will likely assert that some form of debt must be paid, especially if the remaining Garleans wish to pound their chests about Garlean pride and how Garlemald will rise again. Much like how Ishgard is still technically in the process of making amends with the dragons of Dravania. While healing and compromise is possible, these things take no small degree of time and sacrifice. But we happily see the twins and Erenville off, wishing them well and returning to the task at hand, as a few unknowns still remain here on Tural. For one, the key that is still in the Warrior of Light's possession is still a tremendous mystery. However, I already devoted an entire video to that, so I'll leave a link in the description for those who want to continue with that conversation. But beyond the key, the remaining crew decided that learning more about the Ninth Reflection itself and its ultimate fate was important. Because while Alexandria may have been teleported to the source, living memory was still existing within the reflection itself, meaning that something had to be there below the clouds that surrounded it. Upon traveling to the Ninth, they discovered that a functioning airship was indeed available in case of emergencies. Sphene was surprised to see a faithful recreation of a once-beloved vessel, as she, the Warrior of Light, Cryle, Y'shtola, and Grahatia all decided that it was time to fly below the cloud cover and learn of the reflection's current state. And what they found was devastating. Unlike the first reflection that had a landmass that was spared from the flood of light, it would appear that the Ninth was entirely covered by its own calamity, resulting in constant lightning showers and ceaseless storms. It's fair to say that this sight was likely what anyone would have seen during the second umbral calamity upon the source, back when the 12th reflection was rejoined thousands of years ago. And much like the survivors of the second calamity, our party decides to head underground first, both to avoid the Levin storm, but also head through the mountain in an attempt to learn if its neighboring nation of Treno was still on the other side, as Sphene remarks that Treno tried to remain neutral when war broke out across the world, remaining on decent terms with Alexandria even to the end. Our heroes fight their way through the caves rather easily, which turned out to be an old and abandoned mine. But upon reaching the other side, they not only find that Treno is still around, but had an arcane dome that was barely holding on. Deciding to lend their strength and quickly put down any and all monsters invading this once noble nation. The current inhabitants thanked them for their aid, but both parties were shocked to see one another. Nobody expected a reflection now consumed by an elemental calamity to have any survivors, and Treno thought Alexandria was destroyed when it suddenly disappeared one day, leaving nothing but a crater in its wake. It would appear that both sides had much to reveal to one another, so Sphene and Y'shtola decided to meet with Treno's current leader, Miaili, to discuss current events. Meanwhile, Cryle, Grahatia, and the Warrior of Light all decided to tour the capital itself to get a better feel for its condition and history. It would appear that their current culture was made entirely of Lalafell, specifically Lalafell that, for the most part, descended from those of the Malala that migrated from the source to the Ninth Reflection. This explains why they survived instead of perishing to the calamity, as the Lalafell's knowledge of Arcanima is still a powerful force to this very day. If it wasn't for the magical know-how from the source, it's extremely likely that this protective dome would not exist. Not only that, but it would appear that they were able to save some animals from being killed or corrupted by the Levin storm as well, keeping them around for either beasts of burden or for other resources that they help provide. But midway through their exploration, they meet Lummel and his sister, Ayane, two grandchildren of Miaili, who've both been doing their part to keep Treno running as best as it can, despite the dire circumstances. They lament that the barrier, which is barely holding on as is, was now being sustained with the spare parts of spare parts, and that it would take an entirely fresh supply of electrope from the nearby mines to fully restore its power. But the mines were overrun by monsters ages ago, and the Lalafell had yet to gather the strength to retake the mines, since they've been having to devote most of their strength to defending what little they had. But to their surprise, the Warrior of Light's team explained that they defeated most all the monsters that dared to challenge them in the mines whilst looking for Treno, and it was likely safe to mine any remaining resources from there. Upon hearing this, Lummel wasted no time in going to the mines with Grahatia to begin the process of bringing said resources back to Treno, leaving Kryl and the Warrior of Light to attend to a few other things in the meantime, like chasing away lightning sprites so that they don't overcharge or drain nearby electrical systems. But during these chores, the Warrior of Light finds Kryl in a moment of doubt, choosing to sit with her and talk. Kryl always knew that she was adopted, but never truly questioned it like she did now. While it's true that the reveal of having been from the Ninth Reflection and getting to speak with the memory of her parents left a large impression on her, it would appear that discovering actual Lalafell here in Treno caused her heart to ache. Would she be abandoning her people were she to leave Treno? But wouldn't staying in Treno mean that she's also abandoning her found family within Old Charlian? And what about the students of Baldessian? This organization was the living legacy of her adopted grandfather Galuf, who raised and cared for her when nobody else could. Even when Kryl awoke to the echo and it began to upset her, Galuf soothed his granddaughter and devoted an entire research team to learn more about the echo and its nature, all because of Kryl. And so her heart was torn, and confided this crisis of identity to the Warrior of Light. She didn't want to abandon the students of Baldessian, but she also didn't want the Lalafell here on the Ninth to feel like she didn't care either. But she hadn't made up her mind on what to do just yet, explaining that it felt nice to have someone to talk to, someone to voice her doubts alongside. So after a heartfelt conversation, the two of them eventually head back to inform Ayane that they had chased away all the lingering sprites that they could find. It was about that time that Lummel and Graha also returned triumphant, declaring that resources were now being brought from the mines as they spoke. But thanking the Warrior of Light and their friends was short-lived, as a klaxon began to sound, warning that something called the Doom Train was headed towards Treno. Apparently, the Doom Train was an abominable creation of Limblum, made to race across the land and leave a trail of terrible monsters in its wake. It was once simply a machine of war, but now that the storm surge had devastated the entire world, the Doom Train simply continues its original assignment. We can assume that despite being an arcane entity bound to a machine, its primary source of power has been the electrope it's made from, meaning that with the lightning constantly raining down from the sky, it never ran out of power no matter how far or fast it moved, riding endlessly to spread danger and misery wherever it runs. And to make matters personal, the last time it approached Treno, its arrival claimed the lives of Lummel and Ayane's parents. However, Ayane was resolute, determined to use the new supplies to fix Treno's barrier and bring it back to 100% power despite the danger. However, Lummel took a different approach, as the Warrior of Light and their allies seemed entirely unbothered by the approach of a powerful war machine. In fact, the Warrior of Light offers to challenge the runaway monstrosity themselves. Neither Kryl or Graha are surprised by this and leave the Doom Train in the capable hands of the Warrior of Light. Lummel is a bit unnerved by how casually the Warrior of Light is challenging something so dangerous, but offers to drive another train to help them challenge it properly, which they do, and the Warrior of Light engages the Doom Train without hesitation. True to their defiance, the Warrior of Light makes short work of the Doom Train, slaying it and ensuring that its long rampage was finally ended. But the Doom Train itself was never the only problem, as its presence stirred a variety of dangerous creatures into action. But Kryl and the others were eager to lend aid as they used powerful magic and techniques from the source to make short work of these lightning-based monstrosities. With the defeat of a behemoth under their belt, things finally began to calm down and the barrier around Treno came back online. This time, replacing the fractured red glow with a steady and reinforced blue shade. With the barrier once again restored to full power and the Doom Train defeated, the people of Treno were entering a time of ease they've likely not felt for quite some time. But with their deeds done, it was time for the Warrior of Light and their allies to return from whence they came, having learned that Treno wasn't the only civilization that was doing its best to survive the ongoing calamity. While it was nothing tremendous, small groups of survivors have apparently been exchanging goods and services via the railways to get what they need. And now that Treno was back in a much more stable position, it gave them the chance to not only enrich their own lives, but possibly lend greater aid to other survivors as well. But the Scions weren't done helping, as they promised to eventually return with their own cure for Levin sickness, which would undoubtedly be more common here on the Ninth Reflection than anything we've seen within Solution 9. But by far, the biggest reveal for Kryl was the realization that Miaili was the sister of her mother, making her not only Kryl's aunt, but Lummel and Ayane relatives as well. She now had an extended family upon the Ninth. And yet, despite being offered a way home to the Source, to their ancestral home of Alo Alo and the South Sea Isles, they chose to remain here, declaring that Treno was their true home, despite the ruined world around them. A very bold choice to be sure, but ultimately theirs to make, as Miaili tells Kryl that she'll always have family here on the Ninth if she ever chooses to come back. She tells Kryl not to feel bad for leaving, because her parents gave her to the Source to be free, that they wouldn't want her to feel bound to any one place just because of blood or heritage. Which is something Kryl takes to heart, as she has many friends, colleagues, and adventures waiting for her beyond the barriers of Treno. But the most interesting, or perhaps confusing part of all this, is the fact that Miaili is still alive. Or rather, at such a proper age when compared to Kryl. It's important to understand that the reflections rarely, if ever, are entirely synchronized with the Source. Time is cited as moving either faster or slower on the reflections when compared to the Source itself. In fact, the story went out of its way to state that the first reflection is in perfect temporal harmony with the Source at this moment. And yet, it's also stated that this will not always be the case, as this synchronization will eventually taper off. So for Kryl to meet her aunt and distant relatives in this way is certainly strange. Not impossible, but it definitely brings the speed of the Ninth's timeline into question. Because when Alexandria's dome first appeared on the Source, their temporal dilation was sped up. Decades had passed under the dome when only days had passed for the Source itself. If time on the Ninth was moving that much faster than the Source, Kryl's aunt should definitely have passed on already. Perhaps in the future we'll get more solid data on the Ninth's temporal speed, or perhaps not. Either way, it's food for thought. But after having learned that much of the Lalafel's knowledge on the key had been moved to Alexandria, our heroes decided to head back in hopes of resuming their search for knowledge. Content in knowing more of the state of the Ninth than they did before. But for a moment, my friends, I wish to address the state of the Ninth Reflection. So far, the Warrior of Light has traveled to the 1st, 13th, and now the 9th. Each of these reflections are in some form of decline or disrepair. The first was spared from complete devastation by Minfilia and Hydaelyn, preventing the flood of light from washing over everything and sparing this last remaining landmass. However, thanks to the Eden raids with Gaia and Reen, we now know that etheric stabilization is perhaps possible. The only problem is that it's easier to destroy than it is to create. So if the first does ever recover, it'll take quite some time. But at least the survivors of the Flood of Light have a safe landmass to live upon. The ninth wasn't so lucky, as lightning ether now saturates everything upon this reflection. But even the ninth isn't as extreme as the complete etheric collapse of the 13th. Having been dubbed the Void for a reason, this reflection is in such an extreme state of etheric destabilization that few believe that it can ever be brought back from the brink. And even if they could save the 13th reflection, they are quite certain that it would never be the exact same as it was before. So between the 1st, 9th, and 13th, we see different reflections in different states of etheric discourse. Which leaves the big question, can they be saved? Well, if you ask Halmarut, the answer is no. Those who watched my recent video on the remaining Ascians were likely pleased to see a familiar name, as the Ascian that seems to have been working with Calyx this whole time was none other than Halmarut. The Warrior of Light may have only gotten a quick glance at the Ascian, but that was all it took to instinctively recognize them as something that might need to be dealt with. This sent a cold shock down her spine as she fled into an alley to avoid any possible confrontation. And it's understandable why. The Warrior of Light has managed to survive and eventually defeat the Unsundered, Ascians who retained all their power from thousands of years ago. So while sundered Ascians like Nabrialis may have indeed been incredibly powerful and very dangerous once upon a time, the Warrior of Light has only grown stronger since then. Now they can likely catch, fight, and defeat a sundered Ascian without it becoming a death battle, and Halmarut knows this. I doubt she has any plans on fighting the Warrior of Light directly, but most interesting is her exchange with Calyx, whose memories have been moved to a small, plush squirrel. An odd choice for a manipulative lunatic, but to each their own, I suppose. Either way, his cute form likely won't save him if he ends up running into the Warrior of Light again. Not after everything he's done. The two of them briefly talk about the small fractures between the source and reflections that physical matter can pass through, but we already knew this, as this is the primary reason lesser voidsent have been invading and harming the source over thousands of years. Small and weaker voidsent like imps, Ahriman, and succubi have been doing this for so long. And yet, while Halmarut's explanation on ether traveling between reflections is more or less correct, it would appear that we now know why the key is likely to become infinitely more important as time moves on. The Malala were able to use the key to travel between the ninth and the source, body and soul. In other words, it opens a gate and is able to bridge locations of space-time even if those locations are displaced from one another. Such an unbelievably powerful relic is potentially greater than any kind of teleportation magics the Ascians have available to them, as the key simply bends or even breaks the rules of etheric travel, similar to how Azim's crystal helps to bridge the gap between its owner and their allies. And interesting connection, seeing as the key seemed to resonate with Azim's magic temporarily. But as their conversation continues, Halmarut and Calyx eventually speak about how they and their allies must weather some kind of dangerous event that is approaching. It would appear that Halmarut is certain that the ninth reflection is already doomed. Does she mean that it's doomed to fade and decompose into a similar state as the 13th? becoming a second void charged by lightning? Or does she mean something much worse? The final days might have been halted, 'tis true, but Zodiark's essence had been interwoven into the star upon his creation. And then Hydaelyn became his jailer when she sundered the world. With both of them gone, what force is now uniting the source and the reflections, if any? Perhaps without Zodiark, all reflections are now doomed to either drift or dissolve into nothing. After all, they don't occupy the same space as the source, and yet they share the same universe. As far as the cosmos is concerned, perhaps the reflections aren't all there, and as such, they are doomed to perish without the uniting power of Zodiark, or something comparable to keep them rooted within reality. But of course, that's just me theorizing based on available data. So far, we've no idea what these Winters are really planning, only that they're certain something terrible is coming, and that the Warrior of Light, in their ignorance, is ensuring that whatever it is will certainly happen. But that is my summarization and lore breakdown of Final Fantasy XIV's patch 7.4 MSQ. Tell me, my friends, how did you enjoy the story? Are you glad that Kryl finally got the screen time that she deserves? And what terrible fate do you think the Winterers are trying to weather? And where do you think the story will take us next? For my part, I believe the twins being in Garlemald certainly gives us a reason to travel back to Ilsabard, which is something I'd very much enjoy personally. But the power of the key could potentially take us to another one of the remaining reflections. Perhaps for once, we'll see a reflection that isn't dead or dying for a change. Either way, I'll look forward to seeing your thoughts in the comment section below. But as always, while we wait for the eventual conclusion of Post-Dawn Trail, stay safe, my friends. Thank you all for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. But before I go, I'd like to acknowledge my biggest contributors. A grand thank you to Amina Voltaria, Nare, and Potato. Links to things like my channel Discord, social media, and connections to my channel artist Caddy can be found down in the description below. Thank you all once again for your viewership, and I hope you have a wonderful day.